working on a dream project, and that dream project has been creating a new model to support therapists actually in engaging with clients around racial trauma. We know that it's a big challenge to access training for clinicians. We're often really busy and working for agencies that don't give a lot of time for training. And we actually also don't get that many spaces to be very vulnerable with each other. Actually, we're often talking about clients and not ourselves. So this project is a culmination of both being in clinical practice for quite a while now, and also as a multiracial clinician, noticing that a lot of other multiracial clinicians aren't addressing racial trauma in the ways that they would hope to often with clients. The summary of the problem really is that we have a lot of documented evidence that internalized racism has been correlated with psychological distress, negative self-esteem, low self-worth. And if we look at this from multiple dimensions, we can see that not only is there a paucity of evidence-based practices about healing for racial trauma and specifically internalized racial oppression, but we also really have a need for evidence-based practice to support clinicians. So clinicians often can't access those healing modalities for clients and then also for ourselves. This research really specifically targeted the consequences of racial isolation and negative self-beliefs regarding belonging. So I really targeted the idea of belonging after conducting a needs assessment and heard from many multiracial therapists and leaders in community work saying, you know, I actually don't show up at larger social justice events that are organized around racial identity because I'm not sure where to go. I'm not sure if I belong there. So 3 dimensions of the problem were identified, both the evidence-based practice needs, and then also that there's psychological impacts that are not really being addressed right now in literature and practice. So said in other terms, we actually, DeLuca and colleagues conducted a pretty large meta-review in 2018. They looked at over 12,000 mindfulness and meditation-based interventions, and they found that only 12.5% included cultural adaptations or tailoring for BIPOC communities. And so within the work on mindfulness practices and healing, a very small percent actually center the needs and the culturally specific needs of BIPOC community. So I'm also thinking about this problem as a lack of cultural consideration in the intervention design and the implementation of these modalities. And we couple that with a historical erasure of a lot of mixed communities, both legally with anti-miscegenation laws, just some of them ending in the 1960s and 1980s in the South. Really, there's a historical trauma component here around isolation for multiracial communities and families, and isolation within mental health care settings as well. So I'm using the term in my work, internalized racial oppression. The other term is appropriated, which I love. It means, you know, that when you're a part of a community that has been told for, you know, many periods of time, negative concepts about yourself, you start to really believe that. You take that on. It's not yours, but you're taking it on. You're appropriating it. And your internal view of yourself, the myths and the misinformation about yourself that's been communicated becomes sort of a part of your identity. So what I found in the needs assessment is that a lot of mixed folks were saying, well, I don't actually belong. I can't show up. When we organize in terms of monoracial identity, a lot of mixed people aren't sure where to go. So I chose acceptance and commitment-based therapy as the therapeutic modality to culturally adapt. And I chose that because it's a holistic, it's really beautiful, holistic modality, actually, that centers on individuals' personal values as a strategy to reduce suffering. So the idea being that if we can identify our values, we may not be shifting the environment that we're in or the beliefs that surround us, but we can start to act from a different place within ourselves. So treatment really moves someone through a process of engaging with 6 core psychological flexibilities. And in the ACT model, they call that the ACT hexaflex, which I think is really funny clinical language. And so this is the traditional hexaflex, the image that you're seeing on your screen. ACT is also a highly evaluated modality. So as of last year, over 1,000 randomized controlled trials and over 400 meta studies have been conducted on ACT. ACT relies heavily on mindfulness-based principles and a lot of thinking about ourselves in relationship to environment. So Rumi quotes are often used in ACT therapy, and I included this one here, which is that this being human is a guest house and every morning is a new arrival. So this idea that we are just here for now and we can keep making our own realities as a part of our healing to end suffering. So ACT is an evidence-based intervention. I culturally tailored it, and this is my culturally tailored model here, which I'll be hopefully publishing and training other therapists in. So what I did is I took the traditional language and I culturally tailored that language to meet the needs of language for multiracial therapists. So when we talk about self-isolation, I use the term contact with each other, that we get together and really get to know each other, tell our truths, find connection, really start to work on self-compassion, and then identifying what we get to claim as our inherited wisdom from all of our different heritages and how then we can take action with integrity. So this intervention was a brief group intervention. I held 4 90-minute group sessions, and all the participants were licensed clinical mental health providers who identified as mixed, and they also specifically worked with racial trauma in their practices. This was a national study, so I actually sampled nationally and recruited 12, 9 people signed up and 8 attended all of the sessions. I'm including here where the participants were located, everywhere from Oakland all the way to Brooklyn. And I'm also included, I think it's really important, the unceded territories that these practice locations are seated on. So participants, most participants, 7 out of 8, had prior participation in what we call a racial affinity group, so, or race alike. So where folks with the same identity get together to process or to do healing work. So the majority of this group, though, had only participated in groups that were for mono-racially identified BIPOC communities, so Black, Indigenous, people of color groups. Only 2 folks in our group had been in a mixed group before, and the majority of the participants had been in practice between 4 and 6 years. The implementation science part of this that I think Dexter just explained so beautifully is that I chose a process model called knowledge to action. I chose this because it's a circle. It really represents to me what healing looks like. It's a spiral. It's not linear. And in this model, we just, gather new knowledge and move it back into action and keep doing that over and over as a way of building new tools. My theory of change was also the COM-B. So I looked at behavior change and I used the theoretical domains framework to look at individual barriers. And I used the consolidated framework for implementation research to look at larger structural and community barriers. Here's what I found about barriers. So the barriers to participation in racial justice or racial healing groups for multiracial adults. These barriers were identified as primarily the belief that I can belong if I show up. Readiness to adopt culturally tailored interventions. So a lot of therapists said, I don't feel ready to adopt a new intervention because I haven't actually figured out who I am yet in that work. And of course, variations in participant schedules. So that was a huge barrier. And the strategies then that I used to address those barriers were using an early adopter, which was myself as the principal researcher. So I did interviews with every participant and we talked about prior experiences and what the sort of ethic and cultural norm and sort of energy of this group was going to be, which was really an everyone welcome mentality. Creating a learning collaborative to reduce the need for individual learning. So saying, hey, we're all learning in this together, and seeing if that was going to support readiness to adopt the intervention. And then I also used a collaborative scheduling tool, which seemed really simple. I used a doodle poll for scheduling, but ended up really shifting the culture of the group because everyone felt really involved and invested in that process. I asked 3 questions about the implementation strategies, about each of those strategies I just named. And tonight I'm going to focus a little bit more on the intervention research, which I found really interesting. So there were some facilitators that really supported the implementation of this group project. One was adaptability. So I used a virtual group environment. It was highly adaptable. Folks could log in from anywhere in the country. My professional network from years of practice and connections from other therapists was really facilitative of gathering folks who were really invested in this project. And also the fact that I had early adoption experience. I've been a participant in multiple healing groups for mixed folks throughout my life, so about 4 groups. So the fact that I had some familiarity with this model was helpful. The research questions I asked about the intervention itself was, if folks participate in an ACT intervention, does it impact the clinician's negative internalized self-belief? So do folks come out of this having more self-compassion or feeling more positively about themselves? Does engagement with this intervention change providers' capacity afterwards to engage with racial trauma in their practice? So do they feel more likely to adopt these new methods with their own clients? This was a mixed methods study design. I had a 20-item initial survey and post-intervention survey, and I also did a 60-minute focus group. And I used some questions from the multiracial challenges and resiliency scale from 2 categories that are validated in that scale: challenges with racial identity and multiracial pride. So let's talk a little bit about what I found. So in terms of the implementation key findings, I was really curious about the use of an early adopter. Results indicated that 7 out of 8 participants felt more welcome to attend the group after engaging in that initial interview as a part of the process of implementation. I also asked about collaborative scheduling tools and found that this really increased a sense of being valued by the entire group. And it also enhanced the mutual aid of the group. People checked in with each other and talked more about their schedules. And I've included a quote here as well from a participant who said it was just really nice to look ahead and to see when people were available. It helped them to actually feel like they wanted to change their schedule sometimes. So there's a lot of mutual aid around this. I was curious about the learning collaborative. What happens when we have clinicians come together and learn together, and we move outside of this individualistic, sort of more Western concept of, I'm going to give you information and you have to learn it by yourself, and you're not really going to get support, kind of how we've structured most of our education. So in this group, it really was, we're all here together. We can ask questions. And I measured that post-intervention with a 5-point Likert scale. I asked about the readiness to use each of these new 6 core psychological flexibilities. And I separated questions for, do you feel more confident working with clients or with colleagues? So I was interested if there was a difference there. And the readiness that I conceptualized was really, does a clinician self-perceive that they're more capable of using that content? So I found some interesting data. So this was looking at the confidence to adopt it with your clients. And what I found is that the majority of the group felt really confident bringing these ACT principles right back into practice. In fact, 100% of the group said that they felt confident using principles and interventions around contact with each other. So what it means for multiracial people to disclose their identities, to really talk about that, to find connection, to talk about heritage. And so you'll see here that the numbers were quite high. Interestingly, they were lower for adopting with colleagues, and I have some thinking about that. But I think future research really needs to look at what are some of the barriers with peers and what are some of the sort of cultural norms within really Western clinical mental health settings that don't generally promote vulnerability or some of these principles, right, that require us to be vulnerable with each other. So the rates were a little bit lower. Another interesting finding, which was when I looked at the intervention outcomes, I wanted to see, did clinicians shift any of their self-belief? And I actually found 2 statistically significant outcomes. One of those outcomes is that as folks left the group, so their scores after the group, they said that they had they were less likely to not have a strong sense of who they are. So folks came out of this intervention feeling stronger about who they were in their identities, and also feeling less pressure or less need to prove their racial identity to other people. This is really, really promising. We haven't actually seen a study yet that looked specifically at the needs of multiracial adults to ask, what would help you to feel more concrete and confident and self-compassion in your identity so that you can connect with other people about that identity. The other intervention key findings, which were about the practice confidence. So how confident do you feel showing up in racial justice spaces? Do you believe your multiracial identity prevents you from doing that? I had a really interesting inverse finding, which is that the scores went up. So they were higher at the end. Folks reported more that they felt that their identities prevented them from showing up in social justice spaces. So I think this is a byproduct of a lot of psychoeducation, actually, and a lot of emphasis on looking inward, self-reflection, and self-reflexive praxis. So I did see increases across the board in confidence to use self-disclosure with clients, and an increase overall in using skills. So what are some of the key insights from this? That providers need healing spaces, that we really, a lot like what Amy and Dexter are also talking about tonight, we really need to bring in spaces for providers and workers to meet with each other, to have productive conversation, to talk about woundedness. And that basically, when we do that, we know everyone benefits, right? The whole system will benefit. That culturally adapting interventions to really look at specific racial identities benefits everyone, providers and clients. And that systemic white supremacy within the academy and within our systems of mental health practice have deeply impacted the capacity to document healing. I found thousands of articles about the negative impacts of racism, structural racism, internalized racism, and very few documented modalities about healing. What do we do with that dilemma? How do we go to BIPOC communities and say, hey, what are you doing to heal yourself? What can we do better as providers? Participants had a lot of wisdom at the end of this project, and I wanted to include their voices. So I've included 3 quotes here. So some of that wisdom was that sometimes things need to break before we can heal them. Another participant said, we can take care of ourselves even if it makes other people uncomfortable, right? Even if it's breaking the norm of the place that you work, you can work on taking care of yourself. And that connection, embracing expansiveness of being mixed, and welcoming the opportunity to find what mixed race means is really empowering. So some of the next steps as I'm designing and distributing the facilitator's manual, this project is really intended to go right back into the hands of providers and to be culturally adapted again and again for very site-specific communities of practice. So there's a facilitator's manual that will be handed out, and we're going to create some learning circles around that. I'll be offering 8-week groups for clinicians and facilitators who already run spaces for racial justice organized around race. And I'll present those findings at some conferences, and I'm going to hopefully also publish a bit in implementation science focused publications. Since this is an implementation science program, we found that there was a real lack of voices around cultural strategies and cultural adaptations for the use of implementation science. So I hope this project can contribute some to that work as well.